Morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, it's a couple minutes after 9. I'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second meeting of working groups, Oregon Energy Strategy. This is Direct Fuels and Industry Working Group. I'm Tom Elliott. I'm an energy analyst with Energy Efficiency and Conservation section. Joining me today will be Michael Friels as the co-facilitator. He's with the Technology and Policy section. Jeremy Hargreaves from SETI, or Evolved Energy Research, is going to be talking about the modeling. Jessica Reichers is going to be helping us kind of behind the scenes, technology and policy manager, as is Abby Reeser. So go ahead and second slide, please. So if you're not familiar with WebEx, which I really was, and it's similar to, but a little bit different than some of the other platforms, pretty straightforward. Kind of on the bottom of the screen, bottom left, you can see the mute, unmute. You can see start, stop video. Kind of further over, you can see a little hand for the raise hand, lower hand, and also reactions. And then further kind of on the right-hand panel, you can see the chat. Use your chat if you have any technical sort of issues. Further up on the right-hand side, you can see if you hover over your name in the on your name, you can change the how it appears. You can edit. You should see the 3 carets, or the 3 dots rather. Beyond that, it's yeah. Let us know in the chat if you have any questions on that. Start stop video, very similar, but everyone's going to want to, when we're further down, we're going to want to stay on camera when we're having the discussions. Go ahead and the next slide, please. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this second meeting. So this is really to understand the foundational data and the kind of the resources, and we're going to use your expertise and experience to really inform the modeling, and Jeremy will be talking more about that a little bit later. There'll be other working groups between now and the final sort of get together on the 22nd of August. This is really to listen to what you all have are bringing to the table. And so this is going to form especially the modeling that we're going to be talking about a little bit more. You know, to present your views, recommendations. This isn't going to, though, be anything where you're going to be voting on anything. It's really more of a listening session than a sharing session. I think that's probably the main gist of it. And all of this is going to make a lot more sense as we move forward. We got other sort of background slides. Go ahead to the next one if you would, Michael. So yeah, this is just the welcome and introductions. And then Michael's going to do a little bit more setting of the stage to really give you the feel for how this working group session fits into the development of the energy strategy. And then Jeremy is going to kind of get into the meat of it with the modeling. And then based on that, we're going to move into more the fundamentals of kind of understanding what it is that you all take advantage of your expertise in the areas of kind of discussion and reference scenario development, and then also look at some alternative scenarios. And then we'll wrap up at the end, close to 11. Go ahead, next slide, please. I didn't mention that this is a public meeting, so there'll be time at the end to have a public comment if there's any time at the end of the sections, and if not, we'll have a link for you to share. So this is an august group of folks from various industries and also associations. We've got a number of different people with different expertise, 22 in total. This is going to be, the working group. So we definitely would like folks to turn on their camera, and just the general rules in terms of being respectful and listening. And I don't think that's really going to be an issue or anything. We also will be all in the panelist mode. And so just kind of the normal protocols as far as that goes. And then I think that's probably mostly it for that. I think, again, look at the list of your colleagues and just know that there's different kind of skill sets and experience. And that's kind of what we're looking for here. So next slide, please. So to kind of move into the meeting, please, in the chat, put your name and the group, the affiliation, where you're from physically, geographically, and then maybe just as an icebreaker, something fun that you like to do this summer, other than join these working group meetings, or how you stay cool in the summer, just something kind of a little bit light to kind of ease into the rest of the meeting. I'll give you a few minutes for that. I see Jessica's kind of chimed in on the chat, so she's going to be helping behind the scenes there. Excellent. So go ahead to the next slide as you're finishing entering your information. And I'd like to introduce Jeremy Hargreaves and let him introduce his team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research, and we're leading the technical modeling part of the project. We are part of the larger Clean Energy Transition Institute team that's producing the state energy strategy, and that's being led by Eileen and Ruby, who are on the call today. And then other members of our team are detailed there as well, including from Moment Energy Insights and from Rockcrest Consulting.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Michael, and he's going to kind of set the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Tom said, my name is Michael Friels, and I'm a policy analyst at Oregon Department of Energy. So the first thing I want to start with was just kind of checking in after our first working group meeting last week. I know we had a lot of information we were providing there, and I just want to take some time at the beginning to see if there were any kind of outstanding questions people had about the energy model or the process. So I just want to take a couple of minutes here and see if we can pause and see if there's some clarifying questions that would be that we can help work with. Especially we've got Jeremy here going to answer some of those questions. And I guess before we jump into that at a high level, I want to just kind of go over the model itself. We're looking at Oregon's energy system, and there's two pieces to it. We're looking at demand from the commercial industrial, and transportation end use sectors. And then on the other side, the supply side, to meet that demand through electricity, direct use fuels, and the transportation fuel sectors. at just a very high level, and we are looking at kind of generally looking at the state as a whole. And so we can't narrow it down to like, we know exactly this project is going to have it in this location for the future. And this isn't a direct prediction of the future so much as we're forecasting what things could be and how they would change in relationship to each other. And so I just want to kind of do some level setting there and make sure people understand that and that the goal of the energy strategy isn't itself to meet our existing greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And so that at a high level is kind of the framework for the model. But let me pause and see if there's any questions in the chat, or if somebody wants to raise their hand and jump in there and ask a question. We're happy to answer it now. Okay. Well, I'm impressed. I certainly didn't get this stuff the first time I heard it, and there's a lot to it. But if we don't have any questions now, I'm just going to move forward. Okay. Okay, so where we are in the process. So you might remember this slide. I believe it was in the first working group meeting. So we are at the technical approach, the beginning of development of the energy strategy. And what we're trying to do is collect a bunch of data and assumptions that will feed the energy modeling. And we're having these work group meetings. This is one of 8 kind of subject area working group meetings that we're having with the goal of having all these meetings, collecting a bunch of information, and then coming up with a draft modeling proposal and how we're going to model. So within all these conversations, we're trying to find the best available information for these data and assumptions while maintaining, we want to meet our climate goals. We want to maintain safety and reliability within the energy system, but also look at some non-energy costs and benefits, whether those are economic, jobs, or addressing equity or environmental justice concerns. And we want to incorporate all those things within this energy strategy. And so at this point, we're at the technical approach. So we're working in these working groups to get all that information together. And then later this month, we will come together again as a group, just like we did in the first meeting, to have a meeting and have a conversation about this is what we're hearing and this is what we're going to do moving forward. Okay, and so this I don't want to spend a ton of time on, but I want to kind of give you a whole breadth of all the different things, the bill that's driving this, House Bill 3630. We have to include all these different aspects of the energy strategy. And so it's beyond just the energy system. We're looking at community benefits, environmental justice, equity, and all these other different aspects that are critical to our long-term future. But some of these don't actually have a great data that we can inform the model, but we can use these when we're doing analysis of that modeling and kind of the lens that we can look at things through as we're making decisions. Eventually, we're trying to get to a point where we're having some policy conversations that will happen at the beginning of next year. So existing energy policy within Oregon will be the foundation for the energy strategy. And our goal is to match within our reference scenario, the 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050 that's in Executive Order 2004. And so we're using that as our goal for our reference scenario that we're going to use. So that's kind of our baseline for the energy model. We'll also be we'll be incorporating existing policies like House Bill 2021 and the Climate Protection Program. And a lot of these existing policies will get us within that reference scenario really close to those greenhouse gas emission reductions in that reference case. And so we'll do a couple of assumptions, and we'll certainly talk about related to direct use fuels and industry here, some of those data assumptions we're planning to use, and we'd love to get your feedback on them. But a lot of these policies, including like the Clean Fuels Program, Advanced Clean Cars, a variety of different policies within the state are advancing Oregon quite a bit and will get us very close to those goals. And it's good to acknowledge that. So at a high level, the summary of the modeling approach, what we're going to talk about first is the reference or base case to get us to that 80% reduction. And we're going to focus on that quite a bit today. And then beyond that, once we kind of establish that baseline, we're going to talk about the different scenarios or the different what ifs that could build off that. And so if it could be, what if there's more or less transmission? What if for direct use fuels, what if an alternative fuel, like let's say hydrogen or something like that, became readily available? How would that change our options within Oregon? Would that be produced in the state or produced out of the state? There's a variety of kind of what if questions. And from that, you kind of think about, what information you would like to get out of the energy strategy, and how could we frame that as far as a research question or something to look at. So I did want to make sure with direct use fuel, sometimes there's confusion on what that includes. And so when we're saying direct use fuels, we are talking about fuels used directly in the residential, commercial, and industrial sector. So in Oregon, a lot of that is natural gas and also biomass and a variety of different petroleum fuels. So we're not necessarily talking about natural gas that's used indirectly, used to make electricity or generate electricity, or biomass to generate electricity. We're talking about fuels used directly in those end use sectors. So make sure that everybody's familiar with that. Okay, so now we're going to have Jeremy present and talk about it's kind of the energy modeling and around the reference scenario. Jeremy?
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
So what I want to do in the next few slides is just give a recap of what we went through in the kickoff meeting, just to remind everybody of the modeling approach at a high level. And then we'll dig in a little bit deeper about how the modeling is addressing direct use fuels and fuel blends in general. And then that'll lead into both discussion about the assumptions that we're making and potential points of input that Michael will cover in the slides following. So to recap on where we left off in the kickoff meeting, we go to the next slide. We're starting from a model of Oregon's energy economy. So this is a bottom-up model of all of the energy consuming technologies across all of the different subsectors of the economy. And those technologies can be consuming different types of energy. So they could be electrical appliances, they could be engines consuming different forms of fuel, they could be other forms of combustion of different fuels. And so today in 2024, there is a certain split between the different types of energy that are being used, the ways that we consume energy to provide us the services that we require. And in that model of Oregon's economy, we'll make assumptions going in about how that technology evolves over time. So when people are going to replace a burnt out appliance or go to the dealership for a new vehicle, are they buying an electric version of that? Are they buying an ICE, a natural gas appliance? So those assumptions will tell us how the sales shares change over time going into the future, and that'll filter into the stocks. So what do our stocks and subsequent consumption patterns of different forms of energy look like between now and 2050? And that gets collected together in Oregon's energy needs, that second bucket. So this is the aggregated need for electricity, for liquid fuels, for gaseous fuels, and where it's important to have a time component there. For example, in electricity and also in hydrogen, hourly modeling is required to be able to both meet the reliability criteria of the energy system and also to work out what kind of investments are going to best serve the energy economy in the future. And that feeds into our supply side model, which is a capacity expansion and operations model. This is looking at all of the different supply chains to provide the various forms of energy, and it's constrained by our clean energy goals, it's constrained by our emissions goals, and looking at how to build out generation, transmission, storage, different fuel supply components of the different supply chains, and then carbon management as well. So go to the next slide. And this slide is describing the process that we're going through with these working group meetings and the meetings that we've had already with data holders. So that modeling process I went through on the previous slide, that is the middle bar there, the energy modeling. It's a combination of our energy pathways model on the demand side and our RIO model on the supply side, we're looking for the best available data to go into these models. So first, we want to establish a very accurate depiction of what our current energy use looks like in Oregon. What do the stocks of different technologies look like? What does the existing electrical system look like? What do our fuel options and fuel prices look like? And so for both the demand side and the supply side, we're characterizing that through things like energy service demands for different forms of energy, like heat, cooling, light, steam, how those might change over time based on changes in population or changes in industrial activity in the state. What are the technology options, both on the demand side and the supply side, that customers or utilities, developers can invest in, and what are their capital operating installation costs? So we're looking for publicly available data sets, Oregon-specific data sets that can provide us all of that information. And that's a process that we've gone through with different data holders in the state to make sure that our databases are the best available. And then on the top of this chart, we have scenario assumptions, and those are the things that are changing between the different scenarios. And Michael mentioned we have a reference scenario and then 5 additional scenarios we can use to look at different important questions to Oregon. And the types of things that we could change here are, on the demand side, things like the sales share in each year going forward of different technologies, the expected fuel switching that's happening in industry, then policies like IRA. What is the impact of policies that provide incentives on the demand side to sales of different technologies? And then on the supply side, the limitations on when, where, and how much of different forms of resource can we invest in. And when we're talking about direct use fuels, that's important when it comes to nascent supply chains, things like clean fuels production, both from biomass, from hydrogen. When and how much could we actually build? Are there constraints to building out those supply chains? And linked to the demand side, what are the markets available for those types of fuels? And we could break those down into direct use fuel and upstream requirements for clean inputs. So if we're thinking about drop-in fuels, things that could be used in existing internal combustion engines or other combustion processes, then what are the processes by which we could make synthetic hydrocarbons that could substitute for the fossil equivalents? And then all of this is constrained on the supply side by our emissions targets, by our clean energy targets. Next slide. One distinction that we're making in this modeling, which is long-term going out to 2050, is between forecasting and backcasting. And for these purposes, forecasting we're describing as projecting changes based on expected customer behavior, given incentives, given technology, given current policy. So it's kind of where current conditions would take us forward into the future. And that's not necessarily going to hit our future targets or hit our future targets in the most efficient manner. And so backcasting, in contrast, is looking at those future goals. It is something that we know about the future now because those targets have been set, and we know that we need to reduce our emissions. We need to get to clean electricity. And so working back from that point, what are the types of investments that we should be making in Oregon that sets us on a cost-efficient path forward, that is both cost-efficient and also meeting the various and potentially competing objectives that might be present in Oregon. And the chart on the bottom there on the right-hand side is showing the importance of putting near-term policy or near-term investment decisions in the context of that long-term pathway, because looking across different types of infrastructure, we only have a certain number of bites at the apple. And so if we're thinking about appliances in homes that maybe have a 10-year lifetime, then we have 2 or 3 opportunities to be replacing that technology with a cleaner technology or a technology that better fits with a path to these targets in the future. AC and furnaces, maybe a slightly fewer number of opportunities because these have longer lifetimes. Vehicles, even fewer. And then when we think about industry and the power sector, things like boilers, power plants, and definitely transmission lines are all things that if we build them today, then there is a good chance that they are going to be around in the 2040s and 2050. And so we don't want to be locking in technology right now without considering those decisions in the context of what we need them for in future years. Next slide. We are modeling about 80 demand subsectors across the economy, and we're taking that approach of looking at sales shares and what sales share does to stocks and what that stock transition over time does to our energy demands. And that's going to give us as I was mentioning in that first high-level modeling approach slide, a demand for different types of fuels by sector based on what kind of technologies are adopted. And on this slide, we're listing some of the major energy consuming subsectors that are being modeled. We go to the next slide. And the approach that we're taking to modeling is economy-wide and very much integrated across the various different energy sectors. So we're not thinking about these things in isolation. We're not thinking about electricity in isolation from transportation and isolation from buildings and isolation from industry and so on. All of these things are interconnected together because a common linkage between them is the type of energy that they're consuming. And if we're thinking about upstream interactions, we might see increasing dependencies or interaction between the electric sector and other fuel sectors. And the right-hand side chart there's a lot of detail there, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but that's just listing out some of the different resource categories that we're optimizing for in the model. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail focused on fuels in a couple of slides. Next slide. So sector coupling, there are challenges and opportunities associated with this. We're using this economy-wide approach because realistic solutions to planning for getting to low carbon futures are going to involve some level of sector coupling between electricity and other sectors. And that coupling happens between electricity and clean fuels production. And that filters into both avoiding fossil fuels or avoiding other forms of clean fuel in the fuel sectors, but also providing grid services through large flexible loads on the electricity side. And so that gives us opportunities that if we were looking at electricity in isolation or looking at fuels in isolation, then we wouldn't be capturing the efficiencies possible there. So questions here, what are the regional implications of fuel and electric sector coupling? And then looking at the future-proof investments and managing risk by understanding new opportunities and the speed of change. There are a variety of technologies that we don't see present in our system right now, our largely fossil-based system, and understanding how these can work together in the future is a key piece of planning out to these long-term targets. We are making decisions with the model in an economy-wide, a temporal and a spatial context. So understanding that Oregon is part of a larger system, both in terms of electricity, it's interconnected into the WECC, and in terms of fuels, where Oregon has, it's part of a national fuels economy right now, importing fossil energy from other places. And it's also part of national potential clean fuels markets, where there are opportunities to produce clean fuels elsewhere and then import them into the state. So we can explore the trade-offs between different strategies that incorporate load growth that comes from large amounts of electrification or from development of things like data centers in the state, clean fuels, carbon management, electrification opportunities, and new industry. And that leads us to two animal-related challenges that are impactful on what the ultimate strategy would be for Oregon. The first is the chicken and egg problem. So what comes first? What are the barriers to development? Where should near-term efforts be focused? And this is very much tied to the types of questions we want to ask of the state energy strategy. So there's a lot of technology that we would like to see in the future, but there are barriers to developing that technology. If we take electric vehicles, for example, a sort of easy barrier that comes to mind is range anxiety and the challenge of putting vehicle charging infrastructure in place such that customers actually adopt these vehicles over time. So even if economics is driving us towards an electrified transportation sector in the future, if these other barriers are not lifted, then we won't see the level of adoption that we might ultimately want to see as part of state energy strategy. And then it's the same in new forms of industry, hydrogen production, hydrogen-derived fuels. Those things may be economic when we look at price forecasts for electrolyzers and incentives in IRA. But if there's not a market for those products, then that could be a potential barrier to the development of particularly things downstream like Fischer-Tropsch energy conversion into liquid fuel fractions. If there is not a market to be selling those products, then we might not see the early development of those technologies. And then the second challenge there is the whack-a-mole challenge, which this is a strength of using an economy-wide model, where when we're limited in what we can do in one part of the economy, for example, if we get less electrification because these barriers to adoption of electric vehicles prove to be larger than we might forecast or we might want, then we need to take action elsewhere in the economy to make up for the emissions reductions that we're now not getting from that level of electrification. And so that this whack-a-mole challenge is that if we're doing less in one part of the economy, we need to do more in another. And it's useful to be understanding what the costs of that are and what are the feasibility consequences of that as well. Is it going to be putting a level of stress on other parts of the economy that will be difficult to actually overcome? Next slide. So diving into the representation of clean fuel supply in the model, this is showing what the supply side looks like, and we are optimizing the capital investments and operations across all of the elements of the clean fuel supply chains. So that includes primary energy, and primary energy on this chart is showing renewables, nuclear, natural gas, biomass, fuels conversion technologies. So how are those sources of primary energy treated to turn them into useful products for the economy? And the low carbon fuels produced are shown on the right-hand side there. So we have ammonia, hydrogen, methane, liquid hydrocarbons, heavy hydrocarbons. And we can use scenarios to constrain the opportunities for these, both in clean fuel supply chain development and electric sector development. And if we move to the next slide into the demand side, so we take that low carbon fuel production, so that sort of peach colored bar there is the same as what we had on the previous chart. Then we can show what are the potential markets for these fuels. And And initial opportunities for hydrogen could be replacing gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen with green. Refining is one of the highest value early opportunities for that. Drop-in fuels, so decarbonizing fuel blends. So we think about our fuel blends in transportation, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, heavy fuel oil. All of these they have the potential to be blending some level of clean fuel into them. And as we know with the natural gas system, we could blend some fraction of hydrogen directly into the pipeline. It's the same with some of these liquid fuels. We know we can blend ethanol into gasoline. We already do that. We could blend some level of ammonia into heavy fuel oil, but we can also replace some of these liquid fuel fractions with chemically identical synthetic fuels. So those that are produced in Fischer-Tropsch processes in Haber-Bosch, sorry, not Haber-Bosch, but Fischer-Tropsch, to make clean fuel fractions for gasoline, diesel, and decarbonize that fuel supply. And then there are other markets for direct fuel use, which we don't see today. So we have the opportunity for switching our demand side over to fuel cell vehicles, fuel cells in other forms of energy consumption or industry, using ammonia directly in different processes. And one big opportunity for that is international shipping, replacing bunker fuel, heavy fuel oil. But these assumptions are demand side assumptions, and those would be inputs into the model. What fraction of the international shipping fleet do we think will transition into ammonia? What fraction of long haul trucking do we think will become fuel cell vehicles over time? Whereas those things where we are producing drop-in fuels, replacing the existing fuel fractions with some clean alternative that's coming from hydrogen or coming from biomass, those are opportunities that the model will optimize for and build out the supply chains for. Next slide. And just showing a higher level example here of one of the pathways that was shown on the slide a couple of slides ago. This is showing electrolytic hydrogen. So we can take renewables, goes into electrolysis and produces hydrogen. And that hydrogen can go to a variety of different intermediate conversion processes or directly into end uses. So we could send that into methanation to produce a synthetic methane molecule that could be used directly in gas pipelines. We could blend some fraction of hydrogen directly into gas pipelines. And the rule of thumb people typically use right now is up to 20% by volume. We could put hydrogen into 100% hydrogen pipelines or transport that hydrogen to fueling stations, for example. We could send it into Fischer-Tropsch synthesis to produce different fuel fractions for drop-in fuels in transportation, or into Haber-Bosch for ammonia production and potential use in maritime transport. Next slide. And just a note on model geography here. We reviewed this already, but we are nesting Oregon in the larger energy networks. So electricity across the WECC and the national fuels markets. And this is important because other places are also decarbonizing at the same time. They have clean electricity standards. They're aiming for emissions reductions. And so Oregon is competing for clean resources. It's competing for clean electricity resources. It's competing for potentially clean fuels. And so representing that competition is important to find realistic solutions to Oregon's future pathways. Next slide. And I'll end just on a note about biomass feedstocks. So we are using the billion ton study update as our default assumptions about biomass. And this has been developed by DOE by state and year, and it has costs associated with biomass production. This was actually reviewed in our work on the Washington 2021's data energy strategy, and a team at Washington State University updated the estimates for woody biomass in the Northwest, and that included Oregon. They used their LURA model for that study. So we have that as an alternative that we could use in Oregon as well. But we are looking for sources of biomass potential specific to Oregon. And so if people on this call know of data that could improve our estimates of biomass availability for the state, that would be really useful for us. So I will end there and hand it back to Michael and see whether there's any questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. So Jeremy obviously covered quite a bit on the model and some of our assumptions. I'd love to have you unmute or raise your hand if you have a question or have a comment. Lee, it looks like you'd like to get us started.
Yeah, somebody ought to kick this off. So, Jeremy, I end up doing a lot of work with the folks from PNL. And recently they shared quite a bit of their modeling work that they've been doing for our region on everything from the energy to also the economics, looking at the call it the consumer piece of this. Are you pulling in any of that information from that work that's already been done, or is it primarily just being pulled from the universities like WSU and Oregon State?
So the only input that we're potentially taking from WSU is on this revision to the biomass feedstocks, and that's really a choice for Oregon whether that's work that they want to use. We are currently not we're not using any of the recent modeling by PNNL other than where they have done work on cost estimates for particular types of technology. And the one that I have off the top of my head is that PNNL has done work on alcohol to X conversion processes. And in fact, their work was the source of technology that is now being commercialized this year in the first plant that's out there. And so that is a source for us in terms of technology, pricing, and operations. But we are at the moment not pulling any of their more recent work into our modeling effort. And if there is something in particular you think is of value there that we should be looking at, it would be great to hear.
Yeah, I think I'd like to see where this goes today, and then give me an opportunity to think about some of the recent models that they've done, some of the recent studies, and maybe then provide feedback at that time. I do know that they have quite a battery modeling and testing going on right now, and the other area that I can think of that they're doing quite a bit of work in is in the hydrogen sector that you've mentioned, as well as carbon capturing sector. So maybe I'll kind of wait and see how this develops, and then provide maybe the studies that I think that might be valuable to your work.
Sure, sounds good.
That would be great, Lee. So you can so we have a public comment portal if you'd like to use that, or you can just message me directly with that information or your recommendations. Either works great.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, and then Rebecca, I believe you had your hand up for next.
I did. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Rebecca Smith with Transformers Consulting, representing Renewable Hydrogen Alliance. I was happy to see the slide showing the regional context in which you're looking at for this strategy. However, I was curious about the exclusion of British Columbia. I think that there's real relevance there to include, especially when it comes to hydrogen. Department of Commerce in Washington is, in fact, currently doing a study looking at the linkages for hydrogen production between the two jurisdictions. So would just love to know your thinking on that exclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, so it is something that we would love to be modeling. It is just not something that we currently have a demand side representation for. And on the electricity side of things, the linkage is relatively small compared to the rest of the region. And at the moment, it is exports that are contracted through to California. That if we think about the fixed hydro resource in British Columbia and their plans for decarbonization as well, will likely go away over time. And so we think of the electricity sector connection as kind of a wash there that isn't going to be that impactful. On the hydrogen side, my questions around that would be the eligibility under IRA. So at the moment, any resource that qualifies for IRA is going to be a much more attractive resource to be building. So it seems like the opportunity for hydrogen at the moment with British Columbia will be to export it to that region rather than the other way around. But if you have different thoughts on that, I would welcome to hear how we might think about that in this modeling effort.
Yeah, I would love to follow up on that. I'm not sure that IRA, it will absolutely play a role, but there's definitely the possibility of, companies producing other types of hydrogen that maybe aren't IRA compliant at all, or not for the full $3 per kilogram. And so there may be an import-export market there with BC. Likewise, just, with the hubs located there, if there's a possibility of them having some slow time getting up and running, that they may need some imports to meet demand immediately. I'd love to discuss further.
Yeah, and we just did the Washington hydrogen strategy that was released earlier in the year, and I do think that what you're describing is an opportunity where the pace at which hydrogen could be valuable in the region may outstrip the rate at which it can be developed locally, and so that is a potential opportunity that we're not currently representing.
And Rebecca, I guess could I jump in and ask, so are there good data resources for that to provide some better kind of insight into those estimates of what that could look like?
I think that would be a great question for Commerce in Washington, and we can certainly liaise with them and see what they might be able to offer. And then, also, getting a clear sense of kind of maybe what specific type of data in terms of early demand, just for example, if, I know it's a toss up, but if 45V is implemented as is now with the 3 pillars, then no, hydrogen, no hydrogen produced with electricity from hydro in the Northwest would be eligible. So, that's definitely something to consider as well.
Okay, thank you. And then Tim, I saw you got your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yes, please. Thanks, Michael. So Jeremy, great coverage of the model. It's so complex that it leaves me wondering about a question about another layer of complexity. I understand you've got supplies and cost curves, and you're embedding Oregon in this broader market with some of the raw resources. But I'm curious if the model gets at all the investment decisions that you're hoping players will make, whether that's industrial investments or commercial investments in buildings or consumer investments, and the different thought processes that those different folks have, whether it's a rate of return or a payback period or a consumer looking to reduce their monthly cost, but a whole lot of decisions there. And I'm curious how you translate these costs and demands into really triggers that will drive these investments. And does the model have the ability to say, well, this one is a little bit out of the money, but if we had a policy to help a little bit here, then this one would take off, and that's the one we should do. I'm curious how you handle all that.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a really important question, I think, to clarify. So the way that our model is working is the physical representation of the infrastructure. So it's the optimization is on total resource cost rather than on a participant cost sort of framing. And so when we find one scenario is lower cost than another scenario, then that is in terms of the cost of all of the technology that has been put in place and the operations of that technology. And it's not telling us anything about the distributional impacts on customers or how that was paid for. And so that is the appropriate way to be thinking about it in the long term, because the way that customers pay for things right now, particularly through rates, is not necessarily reflective of the cost of technology or potentially incentivizing them to behave in that particular manner. But it's a useful kind of construct, because what it's basically doing is setting guideposts for the future, say that if our current market structures and rate designs and programs were set up such that we were incentivizing behavior aligned with a least cost pathway into the future, then this is what we would be trying to target. And so it's useful for a energy strategy where the principal goal is policy setting, because then we can set policy that will get us close to that least cost pathway, and that policy deals with what do customers see on the ground right now? Are they going to actually invest in these things economically, given their own cost and benefit analysis? And if not, then what kind of policy could motivate that change in behavior? So that's the way that the backcasting versus forecasting sort of paradigm changes how we think about the results that are coming out of the model. So if we find that current markets, current rates are not motivating behavior that is aligned with reaching these goals in the future, then in the long term we can consider them just levers that serve us or don't serve us in meeting our long-term goals. And if they don't serve us, then we can change those.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Oh, it looks like we've got Michael with his hand up. Michael, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Just wanted to echo some of the concerns that Rebecca had about some of the geographic model constraints. I mean, I can't help but think about the importance of BC and Alberta to natural gas markets, for instance, and also, you know, east of the Rockies in terms of on the supply side, the availability of biofuels and RNG, for example, would seem to be important to include in the modeling as well. So just wanted to throw that out there, and also just had a technical question about the modeling. Is this model a CGE model? It wasn't clear to me, or if this is two different models where the results of one feeds the other.
It's the results of one feeds the other. So there isn't an economic decision being made on the demand side about what people are adopting. That is an input into the model. And so to assess the costs and benefits of different strategies on electrification, for example, then it would be two different scenarios. One being that you move faster on electrification than the other, and then you would do that comparison. But there isn't a feedback happening on making those choices, and that's mainly, we do have the option of optimizing on the demand side, but we find some strange things that come out of doing that, just because unless you're modeling or trying to represent the many factors that a customer is thinking about when making choices on the demand side, then it's hard to get any degree of realism, and we actually think that it's not really possible given the changing nature of technology options and the types of barriers and or important decision points that customers are facing. So we do scenario-based approach there. And then on the other part of your question, so on the gas side, then we are modeling the forecasted natural gas price for Oregon based on the markets that Oregon is exposed to. And so that is going to come from the Power Council forecast on natural gas. So we won't be taking a first principles approach to natural gas supply, and not having Canada doesn't impact that. It is built into the natural gas forecast. And then the final piece of your question on the opportunities for biomass east of the Rockies, that is definitely factored into the model. So the map there, it showed the WECC broken out by state, and that's very beneficial for the electricity sector. But we are also including the Eastern United States in the market for biomass and biofuels production. And so we are capturing the opportunity, and in many cases, the lowest cost opportunity for biofuels production that is happening in the Midwest. And Oregon has the opportunity to draw on that resource as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I guess I don't see any other hands. Jessica, was there anything in the chat?
Nope, nothing in the chat. No more hands that I can see.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to talk a little bit more specific and some of the data and assumptions that we'll use in the modeling. We're just going to go through some of these tables kind of at a high level, just to make sure you understand the inputs in the model and see if there are any questions. And there are some overlap between, for example, we've got some slides on energy efficiency, and that was also went over in the energy efficiency specific working group, but we want to include it in this one as well to make sure everyone has an understanding of the modeling inputs. So as far as demand side, supply side, assumptions, certainly we'll be using some of the modeling work we're doing, modeling what demand is, but we're also using natural gas utility RPs as reference to kind of supply side assumptions. And as Jeremy was just pointing out, some of the price forecasting using the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, as well as EIA's annual energy outlook to use some of the pricing. And we'll be using kind of existing state programs when we're looking at kind of clean fuel investment and what alternative fuels are projected for the future. And let's see, let's go to and please stop me or raise your hand, jump in if you have questions about any of these options that we're taking. And then as far as kind of building envelopes, these are kind of the resources we're using. We're using a lot of NEIA's residential building stock assessment and the commercial building stock assessment to kind of assess where we are in the residential and commercial space, and where we kind of see appliances or their replacements coming down the road. And if you have other data sources that you'd recommend we take a look at, we're happy to do that. At this point, we've kind of identified those as the best kind of Oregon-specific resources we've got at this point. And I know it's come up in a variety of other meetings, kind of concerned around data center load growth and what that might look like. And so Northwest Power Conservation Council is doing some forecasting around that, and that's what we're adopting at this point. So I mentioned kind of energy efficiency in buildings, and so there's kind of some questions around what we want to use as far as estimates for energy efficiency. And again, highlighting that this was a conversation energy efficiency working group as well, but we're making some assumptions around what savings will look like over time, what we think as far as kind of electrification, our heat pump goals, and what assumptions we should use around that. We're welcome any input this group might have on what that might look like as far as in the residential and commercial space, for space heating as well as for water heating. I'll pause and see if we have any input from the group or questions about some of those targets or recommendations.
I'm not seeing any hands raised right at the moment, and you can raise your hand, or if you want to throw your question into the chat, then we can share that with everyone to answer the question as well.
Of course. And I guess I should mention at the bottom, so and as far as industrial process efficiency, are making an assumption that there's a 1% efficiency improvement over time across the sectors. It's kind of a conservative estimate, but that's what we're going with this point. But we certainly welcome any feedback on any of these. Okay, I'll go to the next table and highlight that also this isn't a one-shot deal. Certainly, we can share this PowerPoint with the group following this meeting. And if you have additional thoughts, you can send them to me directly or put them in our public comment portal. That works as well. Tom, if you could put the public comment portal in the chat, that would be great. So people have a link to that.
Will do.
And then the industrial efficiency and electrification. So these are some of the assumptions we're making around electrification or switching to hydrogen, assuming that 100% of machine drives by 2035, 100% of heat by 2050, low temperature industries, and then some processes that can't, they're higher temperature may switch over to something like hydrogen or another alternative fuel. Yeah, and as far as switching to hydrogen, I want to highlight as far as construction energy demand. So there's off-road uses as far as vehicles and construction and other applications beyond what we think of as just manufacturing sector. This would include agriculture and other sectors as well. Okay, looks like I don't see any questions or people jumping in. Oh, Michael, looks like you got something for me.
So when it says data source there,
Yeah.
I'm a little confused. So is that an assumption that's being made, or I'm just I mean, are these numbers from other studies that show that this much reduction can be achieved by these different sectors, or?
This should say assumption because it's not based on any particular data source. And so it's the starting point assumption for the reference case in terms of fuel switching happening in the industrial sector. But these are, if you have input on these, that would be welcome.
Okay, so just to clarify, these are starting assumptions for electrification within the industrial sector.
Yeah.
They are. Thank you for catching that, Michael. I appreciate you making that clarification. And I guess I would follow up. Do you have some recommendations as far as like changes or kind of gut reactions to some of these numbers?
Well, I mean, we know that electrification for certain sectors is really difficult, and especially cost prohibitive, and in some cases the technology isn't there yet. So we just want to make sure that these are all realistic assumptions that are being made.
Yeah.
I don't have any numbers off the top of my head for you across the different subsectors right now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Michael. But if you think of more or have some recommendations or can take the time to think about it, I guess outside of this meeting, we would welcome any kind of feedback you have. It'd be great. I appreciate it. And then Charlotte, looks like you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at this electrification section, and I'm just trying to figure out what technology this is achievable by, because electricity has not proven to be, possible for many sectors that you have listed here. And so I'm just trying to figure out how that all works and how you've estimated that.
So this is, again, the kind of backcasting approach that we're taking, that there is no electrification happening in 2030, and then by the time we reach 2050, then we reach these targets that are shown on this slide. So it's more about the end point. Where do we end up when we get to 80% emissions reductions? And so there isn't a lot of additional thinking behind it in terms of industry by industry. What are the specific measures that they take in that industry? It's just that over the space of 20 years, from 2030 to 2050, this is the transition. And the way that the feasibility question has been approached in this is the percentage of high temperature heat used in these industries, which is really not possible to be addressed with electrification, is addressed through some other means.
So it's just a goal.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because we have, there are even, natural gas uses, for example, in an air quality permit. A lot of your criteria pollutants are, you have to use natural gas to generate enough heat to be compliant with your air quality permit. So these are pretty lofty goals, in my opinion. So.
And just to be clear, Charlotte, this isn't all industries. It's only certain aspects of certain industries. So this is a subset of a subset. So when you look at, it's just like 100% of heat by 2050 in low temperature industries and chemical production and heat for glass. So it's specific types of places where electrification could occur, but not everywhere. Like beer is not on here because it's difficult to do beer without gas.
Okay, well, and so you have some certainty that bulk chemical production and heat and glass production can utilize electricity, because I can call some of my members and check that out. But anyway.
That would be great. We would welcome any feedback, Charlotte, that you can use your colleagues or members and getting some feedback on that. If you feel like these numbers should be more conservative or we should move them in some way, we certainly welcome all your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was looking at the 1% reduction or the 1% reduction from energy efficiency, that seems like a doable number, but some of these just really don't. And that there are some technological limitations. So.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And Rebecca, I see you've got your hand up. You want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. So I have two questions about this, and pardon me, partially following on in the last couple questions, but I'm glad that you mentioned high heat, and I guess you mentioned that electrification isn't going to be feasible for some of those end uses, but I don't see explicitly here that hydrogen is called out as a potential fuel for some of those high heat applications or others. So I guess I'm curious as to, is that in the mix for one of those potential fuels? I'll start there.
Yeah, so that second field there switched to hydrogen. So it's 50% of heat in bulk chemicals, and then 20% construction, 20% in industrial vehicles by 2050. So those are the hydrogen targets in this first set of assumptions here for the reference case.
So you're not including potential hydrogen use for high heat end uses.
So the high heat there is in the bulk chemicals production. Okay. Yeah. So we would have other categories on here as well if there were more present in Oregon. So steel production's definitely, there's no electrification opportunity in the high heat demand there, and so that would be if there were a large steel industry in Oregon, then that would be another candidate. But yeah, bulk chemicals is the larger opportunity there for hydrogen.
Thank you. And then my second question, when you say 20% of industrial vehicles for the switch to hydrogen, I guess I'm curious about what some of the underlying assumptions are that get to that figure. I'm also curious, I understand that the ODOT TINA study for sub-study on hydrogen pathways, looked at, they came up with some targets based on the ZEV goals and then extrapolating them to transportation, like buses and heavier duty vehicles. I know that that might be more challenging for industrial vehicles, but was there any, did you review the hydrogen pathway study from ODOT? Was there any attempt to try to make sure that the assumptions for the state energy strategy are either similarly based in some ways those from ODOT or build upon them? I'm just curious as to kind of that subject verb agreement between the different goals and reports that the state government of Oregon is producing.
So the transportation working group is on Thursday and is dealing with buses and on-road transportation and so on. And so the assumptions in there are developed based on the studies that we've reviewed from Oregon. With the industrial transportation, this is on-site transportation in industrial facilities in agriculture, and the split 80-20 is just 80% electric, 20% industrial is just a kind of who knows how it plays out over time kind of assumption. And so there is some fraction of hydrogen in there in industrial, but in the absence of better forecasting, it's difficult to tell what that would be, and so it's more of a placeholder than a prediction of how things will ultimately play out.
And
Okay,
if I
thank
may
you.
if I could build on that, Rebecca, we have worked with ODOT and the other state agencies to kind of talk through this estimate with them, and I think that'll come up in that transportation conversation. But we have been trying to align with their vision for the future as well. Thanks for highlighting that. Sam, looks like you've got your hand up. You want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Lair with RNG Coalition. I'm wondering, when we look at sort of the different options outlined here, right? Understanding that there may be a limited potential for RNG given all of the sectors that currently use natural gas. I'm curious just to hear from you guys. Clearly renewable methane could be similar to hydrogen in these applications. Is there a reason that it's not included other than you're just assuming that it's used in other sectors, or could you maybe expand on that a little bit? And I guess, maybe it would be helpful to, if there was a note in the final study around the fact that there's some uncertainty around that, right?
Yeah, so we do have, and this could be clarified a little bit the way that this is laid out, because it's not comprehensive, as Alan was noting, that there is residual gas demand in the industrial sector by the time we get to 2050. The opportunity for decarbonizing that gas is coming from both existing RNG sources from things like anaerobic digestion, and then also new biomass pathway opportunities, like I showed earlier on in the presentation. Our model will tend towards using the existing and anaerobic digestion opportunities because they are cheaper and they are gas specific. Whereas the biomass pathways, they could be biomass and subsequent hydrogen can be sent into a variety of different conversion processes. And typically we will, in the model, will end up burning natural gas for a lot longer than we'll retain fossil liquids in the economy, just because gas is so cheap. So on a $1 per MMBTU basis, it's much cheaper than an MMBTU of gasoline or diesel. And so avoiding purchases of gasoline or diesel is a more cost-effective strategy when decarbonizing fuels than to decarbonize the gas. And so we tend to be using that existing RNG supply, but then not really much more than that in terms of decarbonizing with new biomass pathways.
That's helpful, and also look forward to digging a bit more into some of the gasification and e-fuels pathways for some of the other renewable hydrocarbons. The only other thing I wanted to add is that we know of a study from ICF that we think is comparable or maybe a more accurate study than the billion-ton study. I need to check back on how those two compare, but I'll just flag that for you guys and follow up in either the chat or an email with that, and we can look at it. But thank you.
Be great. Thank you.
And I just want to jump in and add here that it's important to remember that this is the first modeling for the energy strategy, and the bill that asked us to do this energy strategy also asked us to update it regularly. And we know a lot of these things are being forecasted right now with not a ton of certainty around them. So as we continue to do iterations of the modeling and the energy strategy itself, there's going to be opportunities to refine as better data comes along. But absolutely, if you have resources that provide information that you think we should know about as we're thinking about these future states of the of using these direct use fuels, then please send them to us. I'm going to throw into the chat our comment portal where you can provide that information outside of just this particular forum. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. Is there anything in the chat that we should address?
We've had some folks throw in a couple of studies for us to go take a look at, which I really appreciate. So keep that coming. We collect all of this from the chat at the end of the meeting and use this to inform our thinking around the model.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, well, I'll hit another couple of tables and keep the conversation going. Please jump in and raise your hand if you'd like to make other statements or ask questions. So continuing on the industrial efficiency electrification, so looking at cement, thermal energy storage, and some other kind of assumptions we're making around hybrid boilers. We do assume that it'll invest, or that we'll have more opportunities to decarbonize these sectors as well, and looking at the process as optimized over time. And this gets us to our first discussion question we want to pose to this group. So we kind of already touched this in part of the conversation around hydrogen and other opportunities. So what should the model assume for the cost and availability of alternative fuel pathways? So I know Sam was mentioning renewable natural gas, and we've talked about hydrogen quite a bit. So what alternative fuels depend on kind of the cost of the supply chains to produce them. And so if you have any kind of recommendations on cost of available biomass, so Sam mentioned ICF study that we should certainly take a look at, cost of environmental or renewable energy, and cost of fuel conversion. We're certainly interested in all these because they're important inputs into the model. So I want to pause and see if anybody has recommendations around that. Oh, and Lee, it looks like you've got your hand up. Jump in.
Yeah, just a quick question here related to hydrogen. I probably should have asked this earlier, but does the model assume that the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub is built out as designed, or does the model try to predict the outcome of the hub based upon all the variables that are currently making it a challenge for that hub? And I think it probably fits into some questions that we asked earlier from my friend from RH there. So I don't know if you want to answer that or not, but I'm just kind of curious to know how the model is going to make that assumption based upon that federal project.
Sure. So the the way that the model is currently set up is that it will build out hydrogen economically, based on the cost effectiveness of different markets, products from hydrogen, and the 45V tax incentive. And it's very dependent on the incentives for renewables and 45Q as well. And so that's driving the initial development of the hydrogen industry. And that in our previous work in the Northwest kind of subsumes the capacity that would be coming online via the hydrogen hub. I think it's definitely worth additional thought on our side to make sure that we are capturing what we think is definitely coming online via the hydrogen hub development. And so one way we can do that is to post check that we have enough capacity that it's representative of that. And if not, or another approach is that we could schedule additions of hydrogen infrastructure into the model. The challenge for us is that it's hard to represent the economics of those hydrogen hub projects because they're not easily the economics are not easily found, and so we're building out kind of generic hydrogen projects as makes sense under the tax credit structure. And just as an aside to that, post 2032, then we have that 45V tax credit going away. And so then the way that hydrogen operates changes after that, because with a production tax credit of $3 a kilogram, then you are very much incentivized to use your hydrogen in a different way than if that didn't exist. And particularly from an electricity sector balancing perspective, you would want to operate your electrolyzers more flexibly, particularly given that their capital cost is a relatively small part of the overall cost of hydrogen production. And so post 2032, the new hydrogen facilities built are operated in a more flexible manner that provides balancing to the renewables that are added to the grid.
Thank you. I appreciate that. As a side note, I am involved in the hub, so I have a little bit of a vested interest in that question. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Lee. Any other questions or kind of recommendations around kind of cost and availability of alternative fuels? Okay. Well, not hearing any, we'll go to the next discussion question. So how should the model reflect potential technological opportunities? Something like advanced geothermal, which is kind of far out there, and it's challenging for us to really make an estimate of what that will look like and how that will be incorporated. But do we have any recommendations on opportunities that are off in the distance, but we'd like to include them, but we don't really have great data to support that?
I would just invite anybody also, if in your particular industry or subset of industries, maybe there's some particular technology that looks promising that you might want to bring up as an example, even if it doesn't apply to everybody, and it might be instructive and generate some conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. All right, great. Michael, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll bite just because no one else is, and it's not anyway, I mean, I would just say, if it's something that, a levelized cost can be produced for, then fine, include it. But I mean, if we don't have a reliable data source that gives us that, that we can calculate that with, then it's kind of difficult to obviously include it in the model outside of some kind of undefined resource mix. And I don't think that that's probably, something that you want to have a lot of floating out there. We want to try to identify these resources as much as possible. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I think that makes sense. There any other comments to kind of build off that? Okay. Not hearing any comments. Certainly, you can supply some public comments afterwards if you have some thoughts or recommendations around that. Okay, so we're going to get kind of into the scenarios and the what if questions that we're going to study. So I'd love to open up the floor if you contribute what you think, some what if question or scenarios that you think we should study around direct use fuels and industry. We've got some examples here just to get us started. What if there's greater investment energy efficiency? So greater investment efficiency and demand goes down. How does that impact the model? What does that look like? What if consumer behavior and costly electrification of space heating? Or we talked about the challenges around electrification of industry. So what if the Northwest production of alternative fuel like hydrogen dramatically increases? What if there's a greater supply of it? What does that look like within the model? And what if Oregon established a more ambitious economy-wide greenhouse gas emission target? So right now, our reference case is looking at that 80% reduction. Would we want to do a scenario that looks at a higher reduction scenario, like 95% or a net zero scenario? What would that look like? So those are just examples, but I'm very curious from this group, what you would like to learn from this energy strategy. What questions would you want to try to answer? Or what if scenarios would be interesting to you in the work that you do? Oh, Lee, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so just kind of thinking about your question about the investment as it relates to our energy strategy.
Yeah.
I think as we look at where we are today, we have built out a lot of our current energy, call it delivery systems, on investments that were made, over 50 years ago. And we've pretty much tapped that to its full ability. And so I guess one of the questions when I'm looking at various projects, various opportunities, is there's a real infrastructure need for jumping the next hurdle as it relates to bringing on new technology, as it talks about switching energy sources, say, to a hydrogen economy or even an ammonia economy, however you look at that. So I guess one of the things that I keep looking at as I look at all these alternatives is we have a real need for infrastructure build out similar to what we did post World War II. And maybe others see the same thing. Maybe others are not too worried about that piece, but it seems like we're going to have to invest in some significant infrastructure to be able to achieve some of these new initiatives as it relates to switching over our energy economy to new sources. Yeah, I guess that's about all I want to add at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, and so Lee, so you want to look at the investment of transmission. How does that change if what needs to be invested in the state, inside the state and outside the state, as well as new energy generating facilities or things like that, and be able to look at the economic challenges of that? Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, I think that's a big piece as you think about electrification. But I also think if you think about hydrogen or you think about RNG or any of these other projects that are renewable fuels, moving that product by truck is not the most efficient way to move it, right? So you have to ask yourself, what would the transportation medium be? Would there be more piping? Would there be more rail? Would there be more shipping? You know, things like that. And what other elements need to be built out to make that efficient and productive? So I think it's bigger than just the transmission lines as you think about electrification. I think the transmission issue is a big issue that there's lots of people trying to solve it, but you know, I think it's good to model it, but I think it's a constraint right now more than a technology issue. It's just a constraint of where we are, where some of the other ones are more technology based.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that the scenarios that we run will really highlight what you're describing there, because what we find, you look across a variety of different scenarios, and in all scenarios, you're building an enormous amount of infrastructure to achieve these targets in the future, and the feasibility of doing so is one of the major challenges of accomplishing these goals. And so one of the ways that scenarios can be used is to investigate what are the consequences of not being able to develop a particular part of the energy economy because there are challenges to doing so. And Michael mentioned electrification, transmission, but it also the fuel side of things is the same. You know, if we do have less electrification, then we need to rely more on clean fuels production, and the scale of that is large as well. So how do we transport clean fuels from one place to another? What type of infrastructure investment and the scale of that infrastructure investment is needed? So that whack-a-mole problem kind of leads to the no free lunch problem, where you just don't have an easy way out, and it's going to take significant investment to get to these goals in the future.
Thank you, Jeremy. John, it looks like you got your hand up.
Hey, thank you. So one thing that COB is considering, and I know this interrelates with a lot of other factors, so it's a tough question to answer. But when we weigh electrification against direct fuels use, particularly in the building sector, we're concerned about meeting like winter peaking load, and that's something that, you know, the direct fuels providers are kind of suited to do right now because they have big storage facilities, right? But when we're thinking of electrification, I guess we need to think in terms of building out energy storage technologies, and that's just something I haven't heard discussed yet. Of course, there's only been 2 of these working groups so far, but I'm curious which energy storage technologies you're looking at and kind of the different factors you're considering in that realm to enable optimal use of renewable energy sources that aren't dispatchable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have looked at the broad spectrum of energy storage technologies, and it was actually back in 2018. It was one of the big motivating factors for the design criteria around our RIIO model. So representing long-term energy storage challenges, both in the electricity sector, but also just clean fuels dynamics and potentially expensive storage options. And what we have found so far, based on price forecasts of long duration storage technologies, particularly in the Northwest, where there's the hydro system, is that the reliability and flexibility requirements of a highly renewable system are, for the most part, met more cost effectively with a combination of the hydro, the flexible electrolyzer use, so large flexible industrial loads, and that also includes dual fuel boilers in industry, and gas. So using gas turbines for those periods of time where you have an energy deficit. But the technology is developing really quickly in that area, and we've seen pretty large price declines, not only in the current cost of those technologies, but the forecasted costs going into the future. And so I think that we'll probably reach a break-even point at some point on long duration storage technologies, which from our analysis is around the $3 to $5 a kilowatt hour level. So the short answer is yes, we have included a variety of different storage technologies, and we can run the model where it's selecting between those and the fuel production options as well. The benefit to the flexibility from electrolyzers is that the energy is for the most part going into liquid fuels production, and liquid fuels are really cheap to store. So that is a really cheap form of energy storage, and it can be stored over long periods of time. So you can have higher production of hydrogen and hydrogen derived products in the summer, and then lower production in the winter. And your liquid fuels storage can be a seasonal type of storage resource. So those are some of the things that when the model is running, it is balancing the investment across all of these different options.
Great,
John, did
thank
that
you.
answer your question?
Yeah. To a certain extent, I guess another thing, if this could just be another objective or finding of this study is, we're interested in knowing just kind of the overall efficiency of various energy storage pathways, right? So it sounds like you're already engaged in this cross comparison of direct fuels and then just kind of maybe pure electrification pathways. But for instance, comparing storing energy as a liquid fuel as opposed to pumped hydro, battery storage, and what's kind of the overall efficiency of the two pathways.
Yeah,
So
I think that
it sounds like you'd be able to do that, with what you're already modeling. So it'd be neat to just see some kind of explicit discussion of that.
Yeah, and we can discuss that. That is built into the optimization. So it's not going to be one scenario versus another where we have storage options in one, no storage options in the other, for example. It is a set of technologies within the single scenario that the model is selecting from. And so it would be based on price assumptions that we would be explicit about what are we assuming for the price of the different options for storage and balancing the system. And the way that the model selects them is kind of the result of that competition between the different resources. And other things are factoring into that as well, like flexible loads on the demand side. And one of the largest ones is resource diversity. So being able to invest in a renewable resource portfolio that in itself doesn't require as much flexibility. There's a cost trade-off there because you could build all of the most cost-effective on an LCOE basis resources, but that would be very difficult to balance because it would be a lot of Southwest solar. Or you can build a diverse resource portfolio that is drawing on resources from different geographic locations. And that's also something that the model is incorporating into that optimization and the balance between different resource additions.
Yeah, and if I could just build on that, Jeremy. So, John, we're also at Odo at this time, we're working on an energy security plan, and we'll be updating that annually. And so I think, there's the modeling, there's the analysis of that modeling, and then there's also the policy recommendations. I think, taking into account the importance, as you pointed out, reliability and security, and making sure, the information we get from our energy security plan is incorporated within that analysis, as well as the policy recommendations we make when we start working on that next year. I think it'll be important blend the two of like our decarbonization goals with maintaining reliability and security within our system. So just wanted to highlight that as well. And Charlotte, it looks like you've got your hand up. Thanks for, we're waiting to speak.
So just curious about, so we're talking about including some of these in the model, these questions, like establishing a more ambitious GHG reduction goal.
Yeah, so Charlotte, so we've got our base kind of reference case of trying to achieve our goal, and then we've got these other scenarios we want to model kind of in comparison to that to kind of see in relationship how things might change, and that's a lot of the opportunity we can learn from the situation. And so a variety of different scenarios. It's kind of like it's a what if question, but it's also thinking in terms of what would we want to learn from this energy strategy? What we model things against each other to try to learn from. Does that make sense?
Well, it sort of does, but I guess my question is more directed at achievability and creating expectations and that kind of thing. And I think that 80% reduction is extremely ambitious as it is. We're working through how we're going to get there, and that's very complex and expensive and challenging. And there are a lot of technological challenges, and we already have policy that is ahead of where technology is. And so I would be very concerned about how that would be couched in the report, and what the viability is of truly doing something like that, because I don't think that we have a path forward to getting there. And I think that that could be in a future energy report.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for that feedback. And Jessica, do we have anything in the chat that any questions or statements there?
No questions. I will just flag that Tim added that he would recommend we look at a 100% decarbonized or 100% net zero scenario, since that's clearly what's required by science more broadly and likely by policy in the long term. So thanks for that comment, Tim. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other kind of research questions or what if questions the group has? And if you think of others down the road, please put them in the public comment portal or send them to me directly. Appreciate your feedback. Oh, Valerie, please jump in.
Thanks. So as I've been listening, there's a lot of talk on infrastructure, and one thing I've been thinking about is how is the model looking at, I guess, workforce or infrastructure in that sense, and what the needs and trends would be in that area in alignment with goals. So, for example, looking at the scenario of greater investment in energy efficiency, let's say you invest $500 million more. What does that mean for workforce needs in, production, in operations, just maintenance, all of those things that kind of will keep things running, built and running? Are those considerations that are also being included in the model?
So the workforce requirements are not a direct output of the modeling work, but the investment in Oregon is. So how much is being spent year on year on infrastructure, and those are the inputs that any economic modeling uses to assess what is the impact on different types of jobs and economic development. And so we in the past have worked with a variety of different economic modeling firms to do that analysis. And we actually did that analysis in Oregon last year for some scenarios that we ran. And it was BW Research who did that work. So that is a study that's out there. It's part of the Net Zero Northwest study that CETI did. So that's a current source of information. And then there are opportunities in this study as well for looking at that. And Michael could talk more about those.
Yeah, so we are planning on doing some additional technical analysis around some of those what we say non-energy benefits. And I think workforce development is certainly a great opportunity in jobs and kind of the economic benefits and comparing those into different scenarios. So we would like to include that in. If it's not, so it's not exactly part of the model so much as interpretation of the model in that technical analysis. So if you think of the first stage that we're at of like collecting all the data and assumptions that feed the model, we build out the model, and then it's kind of that analysis of the results. And within that, I think there's a great opportunity for us to look at those economic opportunities and highlight those and share with the public and get some feedback on them. But I thank you for highlighting that. I think that's a great opportunity.
And one thing to add on that is that when we're thinking about what if questions that are framing up other scenarios that we could look at, I think in this conversation so far today, we've mostly talked about uncertainties, about how things might play out in the future or challenges to developing parts of the economy. But there are also scenarios that we could look at that, you know, it may actually be the same scenario, but answering a different question, where it could be, what if we have more development happening within Oregon, and that could be an uncertainty based on the fact that we can't build new transmission or we can't draw on resources that are outside of the state. But it can also answer the question of what if we were to promote more development inside of the state because it has other benefits like jobs promotion and economic development. And so in selecting the what if questions, there's the opportunity to provide a bit more information about what those benefits might look like.
I was just going to jump in and encourage anybody that hasn't shared yet. You don't have to necessarily go off mute and ask your question aloud, but please do drop any sort of ideas or questions you have in the chat, because we do really appreciate your input. And this, I think, is a really good chat and conversation. So still have a few minutes left.
Well, with a couple minutes left, maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of open up and see if any of our public participants have any questions or thoughts that they would like to add. So if you are a member of the public, not in the working group, and have some questions or thoughts, you can raise your hand, and then we can promote you and allow you to unmute yourself and make a statement. Okay, Jessica, do we have anything in the chat or anybody raising their hand from the public? I guess I can't see them.
No, I would like to point out that CETI dropped in a link to that Net Zero Northwest workforce analysis, if people are interested in taking a look at that, but I don't have anything from working group members at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica.
I do have a question that just popped up from Sarah at PGE. She's just asking if we can confirm the meeting schedule. Last week was the kickoff meeting for all the working groups, correct? But for this specific working group here today, this is our first specific working group meeting, and the second meeting will be on August 13th. And I don't think that's quite right, Michael. Do you want to flag some of the upcoming dates for us?
Yeah, so there's just going to be this single working group meeting with this specific group. This is it, and then we'll have another. All the working groups will basically come together on August 22nd. I believe it's 1 to 3, where everybody will join back together and share kind of, this is what we've heard from everybody. and this is our plan going forward. And there'll be opportunity to provide comments then as well. But that's the schedule going forward. There are a couple of working groups that are meeting twice. But this
Also-
one's just a single meeting. Yeah.
I'll
go ahead.
also point out that, as Michael's been saying along the way, that there's multiple opportunities to put anything into the portal, or you can email Michael in particular. But then the working groups don't end when these sessions end. We go off and we do the modeling, and then we come back and we talk about the policy section, which is kind of phase 2 of this process. And so we'll have more of a conversation at that time, which is going to be next year, when we bring work groups back together to have the policy conversations.
All right. Well, given that I don't see any other our questions or comments, Tom, do you want to start with the wrap up?
Sure. I just wanted to thank everybody for participating. I thought it was a really dynamic conversation. This is the part where I throw out a few ideas that I heard, and there's just so many, and it just, gets really deep and shows the kind of expertise and the critical thinking that y'all are doing about this. But I saw some, particularly around your expertise in areas of supply and how that affects, geographic considerations, technology considerations, economic impacts. And then as Alan just stated, this isn't the end here, even though we're not going to have another formal working group here, certainly. And then particularly with those who maybe didn't get a chance to, or are a little bit distracted or otherwise would like to comment, certainly we do want to hear from you. And then again, the next meeting is going to be a general working group meeting on August 22nd from 1 to 3. Looks like transportation was mentioned, particularly as it relates to hydrogen was one of the areas that it comes up. And I believe that was August 8th, which I guess would be Thursday. Looks like that's another 9 to 11 meeting there. And you're certainly welcome to sort of sit in and listen to any of the other sort of working groups. My colleagues at Odo, am I missing anything? Again, just really thank you, everybody, for participating in the great discussions. We've captured so many things in the chat and in our notes, and thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I think you got everything. We appreciate everyone's the comments and feedback you've provided. And I guess we'll send you on your way a little bit early. Have a good lunch, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.